All right, so we are back with My Career, My Rules, and I am here with the wonderful and well-known in the tech industry, Mark Snow, CCIE. This is my brother from another mother and father and everything else, but apparently we were separated at birth just the same. So Mark's here. We're going to have a little interesting discussion, new format for this particular episode. I'm here talking to you about how you grow your career, how you interview, how you negotiate for success. Lots of interesting things, all revolving around making yourself more successful. Mark has got a bunch of irons in the fire, and these irons all revolve around failure.
I failed a lot.
So Mark, WTF? What is so big to you about failure?
There's the only one way to truly learn, and that's to fail. I mean, there's the old adage of a child touches the oven and they learn not to touch hot things, right? But that extends into so many areas of life. I really believe that the most critical successes that I've had in life have come from some of my worst failures.
Absolutely, that makes sense. So when you have those failures, it's a kick in the pants, it's demotivational, there's a lot of things that go on. How were you, both mentally and in reality, making something good come out of that?
That's a great question, and it's differed, right? So I've certainly had times when I failed and it was painful and I didn't take it well and it didn't go great. I eventually learned from it, but it took longer. There were other times where I had learned to embrace those failures and really marinate in them. And those times taught me far more about myself, but also about the ability to be resilient, to come back stronger, and really not to give up and even stop what I'm doing in that time. And so I think that from some of those failures where I've really allowed that failure to sink in and to ask, what can I learn from this at this point? Those are the times that have been really arguably the most transformational. And they get a little bit of odd looks from the outside. My wife, my kids would say that they could look back to a couple very specific times and say, I don't know how, and they said this to me at those times, I don't know how you have a positive outlook at this point. How are you choosing to embrace this? Your world has been shut down. And I don't know how I did either. And I think that it comes with a change in mindset and mentality. It's something you have to intentionally do. And that's really what I want. The irons in the fire that you talked about, that's what I want to do, is bring those lessons that I've learned and how to have that intentionality towards sitting in and learning from those times while you're there, because they're inevitable, right? Everyone's going to fail. Except for you, probably, but
Never, not once. You can quote me.
But in those failures, what are the tools that you would be able to use to repeat to yourself things that might seem maybe rote memorization at first that will eventually become habit, and things that'll really allow you that transformation in the future?
Gotcha. So Mark, you said three things that hit me.
Okay.
All right. So you said you got to marinate in it, right? So you're like, this isn't happiness. This isn't like, no, I'm just sitting there and failure's great. Like, I'm going to have to sit with this.
Failure always sucks.
Yeah. You said intentionality, right? So I have to have the intention. And then the third thing you said was mindset. So I have to have the intention to set my mind into learning mode over failure.
That's right.
All right. And so I'm actually taking ownership of, I'm going to fail. It's going to hurt, but my mindset is going to be on learning and growth from that failure.
That's exactly right.
And how do you take that to market? How do you do that for yourself?
How do I do that for myself? That is a process of learning what doesn't work, failing even at the failing. I've failed at failing, and I've learned what some of those key techniques are. I certainly don't have the market cornered on it. I'm sure there's many others. In fact, I looked to a number of examples of folks that have really been able to embrace that failure and learn from those.
So it's interesting, the idea of failure. Mark and I both dabble, to my understanding, a little bit in meditation. And
it's true.
And one of the things you first are told, if you're working with anybody who really knows anything about meditation, is you're going to suck at meditation as you get started. Your mind's going to race. You're going to beat yourself up about it. And the first thing to ever get successful about it is you have to stop beating yourself up. You have to understand you're going to suck, that you're going to be a failure at relaxing, getting into the meditation up front. In that, it was just an interesting short little example of me for meditation. But with bigger failures, that idea of marinating still doesn't sit with me well. I get the concept, but that's gotta hurt. It's gotta be hard. It's gotta tear you apart, especially if they're emotional or personal failures. How long do you marinate? How do you handle the marination? Do you break it up? Do you chunk it out? How do you go about that? What's your process?
Well, that's the word I would use as a process. It's not fast. There's no shortcuts to anything that I feel that's worth anything in life. If it's valuable, it's going to take time. And it's been in going through that process, reflecting on stories, talking with folks like yourself, with others, and telling them stories of failure that I've had, bringing in and inviting others to tell me when they feel comfortable and open stories of failures that they've had. And in doing so, beginning to get outside views, and then also taking and introspecting on that, and really picking apart lessons that were learned, lessons that could have been learned. What I, for instance, in a story of my own, let's say, felt was the biggest failure, what others saw were failures of mine that potentially I still hadn't seen until I talked with them. And if this sounds like therapy, I'm not paying anyone for that at that time. That's also a very valuable thing, that I pay someone dedicated for that. But it has been incredibly therapeutic. And being able to really look at that, and understand while you're in a good mental state looking back is really helpful. And that's actually I said actually twice. That is what has allowed me to then, when I'm in some of those times, to be able to embrace them during. And I don't necessarily recommend that anyone just starts to try to embrace during.
Right.
I think it's important to look back first. But that is part of my process.
That makes sense. And you mentioned therapy. It was actually resonating quite a bit with me. I remember I had a brilliant therapist I was working with for the last year or so, and I was sitting in a session with her, and she was pulling this thread. And when she got the thread, I'm just bawling and snotting, and I'm sitting here, a grown man, just crying my eyes out about something from childhood. And the session's about to end, and I look at her, and how am I going to deal with this? And she looks at me and she says, "You're going to sit with it." Mm-hmm. And sometimes you do. The good feelings, the bad feelings, you have to sit. And from the meditation world, you have to be in the moment. You have to be able to absorb it. Now, for me, one of the tools I've learned, and I want to know what your thoughts on, I have to take it in the chunks I can. Mm-hmm. So I might sit with it for 10 minutes and it becomes overwhelming. And so then I go distract myself, and I go to a project I want to do and then go back. Right. How do you go through that piece of the process?
That's a really great point that you're bringing up, is having a mechanism that you know ahead of time is essentially an escape. If things get too intense while I'm focusing on this past failure and looking at what could I have learned, what could I have drawn out, and before I'm really ready to bring anyone else into that story, having something that I can use to be an escape, to say, okay, there's a time limit, and there's a number of different ones. Time would be one. Some sort of audible reminder. So sometimes I'll set a timer. Sometimes I'll have a mnemonic or something that I'll use, that if I'm getting too much, I'll say to myself, and it will kind of snap me out, and I'll take a walk. And maybe I won't come back to it for a week. Some, as you mentioned, maybe I can come back perhaps later that day. Others were so painful in the time that it's taken me months to come back to. Mm-hmm. So when you're really looking at all of the failures in your life, at least when I'm looking at the failures in my life, there's a lot of content there. And so some are more painful and in-depth than others, and others are a little bit more topical. I find that starting with the topical ones provide a great introduction, and allow you to get a couple quick wins in extracting value from what those failures were.
Failure training wheels.
Perfect. Failure training wheels. I love it. That is exactly what I'm talking about. That's
Right.
exactly
Before, so you learn in the process here before you're digging down into the shit that really like
right.
hits home.
That's right.
Okay. All
That's
right.
right.
All right. That makes sense,
But
brother.
you mentioned the being here now, the being present.
Right.
That's so critical. You're right. You have to be able to, one, in everyday life, I feel, be in that moment and engage with the person, the situation, the circumstance that you find yourself in. In the same way, when you're looking at past failures, is you really have to be able to be present in the moment you're in, but also be present in looking back at that failure and put yourself back in that space,
Right.
and remember the feelings. Remember, and that's not always easy. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder. But really being able to put yourself back in that moment and think deeply about maybe motivations, for instance, would be one facet of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we all have failures that hopefully we all have failures that we can attest our own actions to. And then I think we all probably have maybe a handful, a spattering, or a sprinkle of failures where there's almost no realistic way to attach our own actions to. Like
Right.
sometimes life just kicks us, right?
Right.
I get a disease, I break a leg, something like that. What do you do with those failures? What do you do with the ones that you can't immediately attest your own decisions to?
Yeah. I try to. One of the things that I've learned is that any failure that I've had, if I'm honest with myself, and that's the key and the hardest bit, I can find something that I did wrong, no matter how small, even if I think it was completely outside my control. I can find something, perhaps wrong is not the most perfect word, but
Could have done
something,
better.
something that I could have done different, better, different, something that could have gone different. And I look at what's inside my control. If I believe in that illusion of control, what is it that I could have done different? What could have gone different? And so, to your point, if I can't think of anything, at least what could have gone different externally, a lot of times that will actually lead me to realizations that I hadn't thought of before, of things that I could have potentially done different. And those are some of the most enlightening times, to be honest. And you mentioned breaking a leg. I've never broken a leg. I have broken one arm, and then another time I broke both my arms. And then another time I dislocated my shoulder, and then another time I broke my clavicle. And there's many others. So I have a lot of physical failures that are easy.
Humpty Dumpty, ladies and gentlemen.
That are easy wins to be able to go in after. Because some people might find shame in those, and that's fair. That's just par for my course. I don't find shame. So those are easy ones to go in and look at. And this is I think a critical component of it is being able to laugh at yourself, or learning to be able to laugh at yourself, which has really been hard for me. And some of those, let's say, bodily failures have been the easier ones to look at and laugh at myself and draw learning experiences from.
Right, that makes sense. So that makes a lot of sense, actually. I'm thinking through I know for me, when I'm looking at kind of my own failures, I have two kind of fallbacks when my brain starts to wrap around. There's nothing I could have done. And the first one is situational. Maybe something horrible happened to me, but I put myself in that situation. Was there a way I could avoid that situation? The answer is almost always yes. And then if that doesn't even occur, then I flip the idea to, what do I want to learn from this happening? Whether I was at fault, whether I could have changed it, whether I could have done something better. Do those make sense for you? And how do you apply that type of thing?
Yeah, so you bring up a great question and point, really, which is that some things truly are outside of your control. And I alluded to earlier, that illusion of control, which I actually, to some degree, believe in, but I also believe in taking ownership. So there are things that seemingly are completely outside of your control. Those are certainly going to be the harder lessons to learn from. And I wouldn't say completely put those to the back burner, either never get to them or eventually get to them. Sometimes you want to dip into those early and see if there's anything that you can come up with. And many times you won't come up with anything. And also that is okay. If you look back and reflect on a story, a past failure, perhaps something that's happening right now, one of the key things is just to take notes. And I prefer physical, tactile pen and paper. I prefer colors, but I will note take about that experience. And if I can't come up with anything, that's fine. I'll leave it alone and I'll come back to it later. But you bring up a really good point. Some are either more difficult or seemingly not possible to come up with something that you could have done different. I would say don't give up on them. Continue to look back, but they are the more difficult of the ones to look at.
That makes sense. And then next question is, because you and I are both big proponents of controlling your mindset, owning your mindset, and a positive mindset.
Absolutely.
If you don't have that, you're not getting where you want to go.
Yes.
This seems like it could have an anchor to that positive mindset. So how do you balance the two?
I thought you were actually going to say this could have a negative effect, which would also be an interesting question. But how do I balance the two? Yeah. So when you're looking back at some of those, you have to be honest with yourself to begin with. And any good therapist will tell you that there are triggers that could put you into a alternate or negative state of mind. And I think that coming to a place first with yourself where and this is maybe going to sound a little cliche or strange, but really truly just love yourself and accept yourself is probably the hardest first step. And if you can't do that, the whole journey of embracing failure is going to be a very difficult, challenging, and potentially counterproductive one. I think that you have to come to a place where you at least are okay with yourself. Mm-hmm. And so maybe not everyone has to love themselves, but at least come to the place where you're okay with who you are, where you are, and then understanding that in looking back, you'll be able to, I'm a big believer in you're doomed to repeat history if you don't learn from it, right? And so that is where I believe in looking back and understanding what's gone on and extrapolating from that. But it does start with accepting or at least being okay with yourself.
It makes sense. And I always like things that are a little more prescriptive. And so I watched an interview, Tom Bilyeu interviewing Ed Mylett, and they got into that conversation. And the way they framed it is, look, you need to spend 80% of your time being grateful for what you have, being proud of what you've done, and planning what you're going to do moving forward. And then 20% of your time looking at things like this. Where were my failures? Where can I improve? What do I need to fix? And that 80-20 rule for me has been really good because it helps me keep way on the positive mindset without forgetting I've got to be analytical. I got to go back and watch the game day footage of everything I do and see where I can improve, where I can learn from it.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
All right. All right. So Mark, one more question to kind of bring it back into my world of building success here. How do you take your failures and build a foundation of success?
So I've got, as you mentioned, a couple irons in the fire, and there's going to be some upcoming announcements, but it boils down to what I talked about earlier, which is diving first into myself and my story, and then bringing on a series of guests that will be divulging their stories and some funny, some painful learning experiences. But I believe in openness and vulnerability. I believe that if you don't have if you're not in that arena, kind of getting your ass kicked, to quote Brene Brown, then you really have no ability to speak, right? Keep your fucking mouth shut. So you're going to find and see some more stories coming. You're going to see a number of real world examples, a few different platforms and things that we have planned. So I would say stay tuned for that. And should be an interesting and enjoyable time for everyone, hopefully.
Excellent. We will make sure all that is available here when it is available so that you're aware of it. I do want to make one point. Mark, several times here, used a term of taking ownership for and accountability for things that happen. That taking ownership term, I think, is extremely important. Neither of us is suggesting that you take blame or shame around all of these things that happen. You're going to take ownership and accountability as a way of taking control of your own life and your own growth, but blame and shame are not part of this. Is that agreeable to you?
Absolutely. Yeah, those are what I would refer to as affects, not core effects, not core emotions. Shame, guilt, anxiety, things like that have no place. Uh, Even being afraid is okay. Being sad, being angry is okay. Certainly being positive, we've already talked about. But shame, guilt, and anxiety are things that, as far as I'm concerned, have no business. And when you find yourself going there, you find yourself going to a very defensive standpoint. And when you're in that defensive standpoint, reason shuts down, your ability to rational thought and rationalize and really learn from that ceases. So it's about centering yourself. You mentioned meditation earlier. There are a number of ways to get back there, but to your point, yes, those affects have no business in your life if you want to move forward.
Absolutely. I agree. And I think one of the most important things I always see from this whole conversation is if things are happening to me, I have no control over them. This is a way to take back control of what's happening to your life. So thank you very much for watching. Please vote on who has the better beard in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel, and we appreciate your time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Check the show notes for links to more information and merchandise.